Hi, my name's Shaheem.
And I'm Ikram.
And we work for a grassroots non-profit charity called Integrate UK, dedicated to kind of equipping young people with the tools and resources they need in order to talk about, racial and gender inequality.
Yep, and our podcast is called Between the Intersections, and we tackle different aspects of mental health with surrounding young black people. And we have a special guest today, Aisha.
Hi, thank you for having me. So, a little bit about me then, to introduce myself. So I'm a former assistant principal in a secondary school in Bristol. I now run an organisation called Representation Matters, where we support organisations on their journey in regards to anti-racist practice and other inclusion identities. I'm a mother, so I have 2 children, 2 boys, and I've just started my doctoral journey looking at anti-racist practice and educational leadership. So thanks for having me.
Very welcome.
Thank you.
So I guess what we want to kind of talk about today, we'll be talking about kind of many things, but I think one of the kind of key things to start on is colorism, which has kind of become a massive discussion over the past kind of few years and stuff. And we just wanted to ask you, what is colorism to you and how has it impacted your life?
Is interesting. I think I experienced colorism before I knew what colorism was.
Okay.
So I'm very aware that typically within my family, my grandparents would make references to my racialized skin tone. So they would say, oh, you're a lighter skin, or they would say you're light skin, or you're a browning. I'd hear those sorts of terminologies. And I'll be quite honest, I played into it. I thought it was a good thing at the time. I was very much I'm aesthetically pleasing, not realising the deep-rooted connections to it. As I began to get into my studies of education and really understood anti-racism and understanding anti-blackness, what I began to realise was the link between colorism and understanding how closely linked that was to enslavement and casting systems and how different people had different value in society in accordance to what their skin tone was. I then realised how problematic that was and how much I'd played into that and how much I had to unlearn and reconsider how I valued myself as a person and not on the pigmentation or melanin within my skin. But of course, it gets deeper than that, because particularly for us, and I'm going to say for those of us who are racialised as black but also identify as women, we're also not just looking at colorism, but also the hairism associated, so the hair texture that you may have along with your skin tone. So I used to relax my hair straight. I felt that was a really important part of my identity. And then I shaved my hair off upon this journey and realised that now I've got my natural hair. What difference is that going to make? And I began to realise that there were much more barriers to me being someone with natural hair and my skin tone than there was if my hair was straight. So now it was almost triple layered, my racialised identity, the skin tone, and then the hair texture.
So you kind of worked in the kind of education environment, as you said. In terms of students and past experiences, if you feel comfortable sharing, what are kind of some instances that, with kind of colorism that you've kind of seen with kind of students, and how's that kind of affected their mental health?
It's been really, really interesting, and I will focus primarily on the experiences of girls, particularly, as they would often come and talk to me. And one of my biggest issues for girls was the fact that those of a darker skin complexion really felt that they were not as pretty as those who were perhaps dual heritage or a lighter skin tone. And that began to affect their mental health and well-being, because they knew in wider society there was this kind of Eurocentric idea of beauty. And so they were really questioning their value in society beyond their educational attainment, because they began to feel that, miss, even if I get a good grade, when I get out into the real world, I'm not going to get this job because I don't look a particular way, because my skin doesn't look a particular way, because my hair isn't a particular way. And what I began to realise and what I witnessed, particularly in social settings, is the disagreement between the black girls in school, and they would almost gravitate towards each other in accordance to skin tone and hair texture, and that became really, really problematic. And then you had the introduction of girls wearing wigs and wearing weaves, and that became quite prevalent in school, and almost saying, well, my hair's straight like this, or I look like this. And it was almost becoming so all-encompassing for them, so overwhelming, that they couldn't even sometimes function because of how they looked out on the outside. They couldn't get past that. But what was also interesting from a different perspective was the microaggressions and the racism that I would experience from different educators in accordance to different children's skin tone. Now, this wasn't necessarily an incident that happened at this particular school, but in education, I talk about it in my TED Talk. When I met a teacher, and this particular teacher says, I don't want to talk to this particular child because he's so dark, he's scary. She's making reference to the skin tone as a justification to not be left alone with him in a room. Now I'm thinking, you're a teacher, you're looking after young people, but you're using his skin tone to determine how fearful you are and if you could work with him or not. Or, you know, this same person challenging me and saying, oh, well, you're not black, you know, you're coffee coloured, you know, you're a latte. Yeah. Almost determining my blackness by how dark my skin tone was. So what it made me realise is it's not just about the mental health that might be experienced of the individual child, but what might be being projected on them and impacting their mental health, just the fact that people fear them because of their skin tone, something they cannot physically change, but affecting their mental health internally, because questioning, will I be safe in this space around these educators? Would I be safe around my peers because of the fear that they have of me? So that mental health exchange on the affected and the affector all at the same time.
Yeah, I think I've definitely like kind of noticed, like being kind of darker skinned, it's like a constant battle of just worrying about how almost big my blackness is. Like things like when you're walking into stores, not having your hood up. If you're buying something, always making sure you get the receipt and everything. Kind of toning down or quieting down. You know, just kind of constantly gauging whether, because of my skin tone, am I being too black? That's been quite exhausting. It's been kind of a constant kind of conflict that I know many other like young black people have to go through. It's very draining. You know, so yeah.
And I guess, you know, from an education perspective, if teachers or those who are working with children and young people aren't taught about colorism or hairism, and they don't know that they need this as part of their teacher training, they may not realise the mental health experiences that some of the young people in front of them are having. So they might not treat it as a safeguarding concern. So they might not be aware that a child is perhaps bleaching their skin or using products to lighten their skin tone. They might not even pick up on it, because that's not a concept that they're aware of being taught about, and yet that child could be hurting and harming themselves because they're just trying to fit in. It's affecting their well-being. It's not even on the teacher's radar. It's completely missed. So it's, you know, down to that granular level of knowledge between those who are educating and being educated for that real holistic experience and safety in the school setting.
What do you think, why do you think colorism is like presented globally? For example, like in Southeast Asia and like East Asia and like all parts of Africa?
The reality is, for me, it all centres around enslavement. And when we think about race being a social construct that was invented, and it was invented as a tool of European white supremacy, we have to understand what that actually means. And when you know that someone's skin tone was determining whether or not they were human or not, even though we may not be bound in enslavement in those same ways, you know, 600 years later, we are living the consequence of those social constructs. So we see it in our systems, we see it in our policies, we see it in our processes, we see it in our advertising and marketing, for example. And so what you begin to realise is that all of those things in the past are drip feeding into the identity of young people today, even though we say, be empowered, be who you are, we love you, be beautiful, whatever, to really build people up. But they still see it in the movies, they see it in the music videos, they see it on billboards and advertisements. And so what you therefore have is this inter-community ranking of hierarchy, and then you have it with communities outside of each other. So you begin to rank. So you might have your East Asian and Southeast Asian being put here, and then you have your Black and Afro-Caribbean communities being put here. So there's already a rank there in terms of skin tone. And then when we get within our own communities, for example, the Caribbean community, there's then a skin tone range within that. And then it's like you're at the bottom of the bottom. And so I really have quite a concern when I think about particularly children racialised as black and brown, but those of the darker skin tone more so for me, is because they're constantly being told by society, you're at the bottom of every list because of who you are. And how much are we doing across society to address and manage that, but also consider how that's impacting on their identity and their well-being. And so we've got this global phenomenon about Eurocentric beauty. We see it everywhere. It's a microcosm outside of society that's clearly going to manifest itself in education. But how much are we doing to really help young people identify with what that means for them today and how they then demonstrate that in their everyday experiences.
Yeah.
I was watching a video earlier today, and Akala was giving a talk at like Oxford or something like that, and he was basically saying when, I don't want to butcher it, but he was basically saying when like, you know, the Europeans kind of came into, basically for kind of racism and colonialism to work, you need to kind of functionally distort history, you know what I mean? Because, you know, that pseudoscience was kind of based around the idea that black people were lesser than. And so in order to explain why some African like civilizations were so kind of advanced and like, you know, like compared to like, you know, European societies, like African societies and their stature was kind of, you know, much superior. In order to explain why some African societies were more civilized, they kind of separated black people. So you'd have the Negroes, and they would be, you know, people who are kind of lesser than, not able to function. And then to explain these societies, they'd have like, they create like a whole separate race. They'd be like, well, they can't be black, even though phenotypically they looked exactly the same. They can't be black because, you know, they built, you know, the way they kind of they build and they function in society, it just doesn't work. So that kind of division is very kind of deep rooted and started from very early on, even in kind of South Africa, with the kind of using the pen to like determine like hair and everything. Yeah. I think it's still like the legacy is still kind of very strong because it's like when we're kind of looking at mental health and how we can best kind of benefit young black people, like how can we do that if we're kind of so divided as a kind of community, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Kind of to follow up, I guess you already kind of talked about this, but like the colorism globally, could this be kind of symptomatic of like anti-blackness?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the reality is we can't divorce the two. And I think we try to separate it because people go, oh, well, it's not that deep.
Yeah.
But you have to think about where the origins of where this thinking came from.
Yeah.
And so for me personally, I don't think you can separate the origins of enslavement and that kind of hierarchical superiority on racialized existence from what's happening today in terms of how we treat each other in terms of colorism. I think the two things are absolutely linked.
Yeah. So the next question was, is kind of black depression interpreted differently depending on, you know, how dark or light you are?
See, now, that one is a really interesting question because I don't think within the spectrum of blackness it is possible for me to say because your skin tone is darker or yours is lighter, you should or shouldn't experience it in a different way. But what I will say, certainly, is that it can manifest itself for both. So, for example, a cousin of mine who is dual heritage, her mum's racialised as white, her dad's racialised as black. Society may deem her as black, regardless whether she likes it or not. That might be the way she's described. People make assumptions on her skin tone. But she will talk about her mental health in knowing, am I supposed to be more like my white side or my black side? I'm not white enough for my white side, I'm not black enough for my black side. Where do I sit? That in itself, for many people who are mixed heritage or of mixed race, depending on how you identify, that has been a mental health issue for some. That concern about where is my identity, where does it sit, how is it affecting me, how are people projecting their identity on me because of how they see me. How could I possibly say that that has any more or less weight than someone who is racialized as black but they've got issues in regards to where they see themselves in society because they've got a darker skin tone? I think it all counts. It all has a weight. Yeah. It depends on how that depression might manifest. It might be different. It might come from a different core place. Yeah. People might argue there are lighter skin privileges and so they might not experience it in the same way. But I think for whatever individual, that depression is going to mean something to 100%. Them.
Yeah.
I guess more when I was kind of thinking about the question, I was kind of thinking about like how people kind of perceiving it externally. So, you know, when you look at kind of Meghan Markle and the kind of royal family, she kind of acknowledged that you know, her being kind of lighter skinned and white passing definitely meant that like the racism she experienced wasn't as bad. It was terrible, you know. But you know, if it was one of us, then the response would be kind of 10 times worse. And you know, thinking about the kind of impact on the kind of mental health and stuff. So I guess I was more kind of thinking in terms of.
And in that respect, I'd arguably say there isn't as much support or understanding even for that level of nuance within blackness, because everyone's just saying, well, you're black, so it's the same issue. Yeah. But actually, when we think about the training that's received, I think from a medical standpoint, most work around depression, whether it's the medication, the diagnosis, or whatever it may will be, is probably more likely to be based on a white male. That's probably more likely to where it's going to start. So then when we think about all the studies and all the ideologies that kind of stem after that, how much of that is really understanding the Black experience? So I think it's actually often absent in the conversation, because actually who are the studies and research based on? And actually how much literature and studies are on the experience of those racialized as Black to be put in and to say, actually, no, our experience is different. It is far worse. There are more things that someone with a darker skin tone will have to go through than someone with a lighter skin tone, but instead we're treated as homogenous. You all have the same experience. But absolutely, I do think there is a difference between them, but there's less understanding and empathy to those with a darker skin tone having a different and perhaps more problematic experience.
Do you think this affects Black women and men differently?
I do. So I definitely think we need to consider intersectionality. So when we think about Kimberly Crenshaw, she talks about the different ways our identities may kind of collide. When we think about the experience of a man, so a white man first, and then we have the experience of a Black man, and then you have a white woman, and then you have a Black woman. If you talk about the power balances and inequalities, if I am racialized as Black but I'm a man, at least I have my gender. If I am racialized as white and I'm a woman, at least I have my whiteness. But if you are a Black woman, you have both inequalities before you even start. I've got a structural disadvantage because I'm not a man. I've got a structural disadvantage because I'm also not white. So from the beginning, the experiences of what I will have as a Black woman will be far harder to deal with than that of a Black man. Doesn't mean that they both don't have value, but from my personal perspective, I think it's harder to be a Black woman. But what I also link that to is the experiences. I do go back to enslavement, the role of Black women in enslavement and what they had to go through and how that's continued in terms of legacy and experience and feeling. But what I also think is important, particularly when you're thinking about the Black women experience, is other things that are coupled in it. So we think about misogyny, which is talking about hatred, but then misogynoir is going, but the hatred towards Black women. Do we understand the extra layer of hatred that exists here? We talk about adultification. Are we now understanding that adultification, over-sexualization of Black girls? So when we think about educational cases, things like Child Q, we begin to realise that actually the fact that she's gendered as a female and that she is Black has played an extra part in her being at risk of harm in her school setting. And so it's really important for us to not forget about those individual perspectives, but understand that it could be compounded, particularly if you are Black and you are also female.
I think the language you use is actually really interesting as well. You know, racialized, gendered. I guess what's kind of your thought process behind you kind of choosing to use those words and why do you think it's important?
Thank you for raising that, because people might go, oh, that's the first time I've heard someone use that way or that description. It's because I am acknowledging that I am projecting an identity on you. I am acknowledging that you have been socially categorized, and as a result of that, you are living within someone else's descriptor of you. So when I am racializing you as Black, I'm projecting that identity on you, and I'm saying, this is how society has put you in a group. They've called you a racialized minority. They said that this is your value and this is where you belong. You are more than just that. But I'm acknowledging that in this conversation, I am categorizing you in the categorization I'm using. When I'm using a gender, I'm saying I'm gendering you in that way. That might not even be how you define, but that socially, I'm using that social construct to acknowledge where you've been placed in terms of society. Now, it doesn't mean that people always agree with those terminologies, but what I'm trying to do is acknowledge the fact that society is projecting an identity on you, and it might not be something that you've assumed yourself.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
How inclusive do you think the conversation around Black lives are?
Yeah, we kind of, sorry, I didn't know. Yeah, we kind of talked about this before in the kind of previous episode. Where it's we had kind of George Floyd's and kind of everything kind of blew up. And then kind of on the side, on the kind of social media, I was seeing that Black trans women in America were dying at kind of alarming, being murdered and killed by, police, the people that are meant to protect them, at alarming rates. I think the life expectancy is something like 27 in America, but no one's ever kind of talking about that. And I saw this one video where I think they were at I don't know, they were at like a station or something like that, and this black trans woman is being harassed, and then under the kind of comment section, you expect to see kind of empathy for her situation and stuff, and all you see is all this hate. And I thought, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, we should be valuing Black lives, you know, not degrading it. So I guess, yeah, we kind of wanted to know what you kind of thought about it. And
that's really interesting. Kind of really tacks onto the question before where you said about, is it different for a black man to be in a black woman? You know, if I said to you to name all of the black murders, shall I say all the black people who have been murdered, you probably could name more men than women. If I told you to name them. Doesn't mean that black women aren't still dying at the same alarming rate, but we're used to positioning the male gender before the female gender. That happens. But when we're talking about this, how Black Lives Matter or Black matters or in regards to life, one of the things that we have to think about here is that it sometimes feels like oppression Olympics, that you've got to pick one form of the identity that we can manage. And actually, if you're asking me to consider 100%. Intersectional lenses, this gets a bit too much, because we could be talking about being black and neurodistinct. We could be talking about being black and being gay. We could be talking about being black and being female. There are all these other intersects, but it's like people find it too much. I can't do so much blackness at once. We can talk about being black, but if you're adding all these extra things, it just feels too complex. And then what begins to happen is we then begin to racialize these other issues. So LGBTQ plus then becomes a white issue. Well, no, because there are people racialized as black and brown who are very much within those communities, hence the change of the flag by adding those extra colors. But when people are thinking about it in a very binary sense, is that the first image that they have in their mind? I say neurodiversity, someone who's ASD or ADHD is a black person, the first person that appears in your mind, and yet we know it may be manifesting differently for those communities. And so you begin to realise it's something about the way we find it so hard to give black people more than one form of identity. You're black and that's everything. You know, it was all in one. But when it comes to other racialised communities, particularly those racialised as white, we allow those different identities to come forth. And so I think one of the things, even within our own communities, that we need to be able to do is understand that there isn't one version of blackness. There isn't one way to be black. And I think because we're so used to being the other, we then almost assume that then everyone's got to have the same view, the same point. The points, like being black looks like this. But yet the three of us, we might all be racialised as black, but our interests, the way we live our lives, the things that we do may be so different. But to someone who is on the outside, just looking at us, they're making an assumption that all three of us will have the same belief, behaviours and attitudes just because of the melanin in our skin. So we also have to be conscious of our bias and prejudice that we put on being black, and how often we don't celebrate the differences in our versions of blackness and don't conform to this one homogenous idea as well.
I think growing up, I really struggled. I grew up in kind of Eastern, Barton Hill, which are all kind of areas that like have like a large ethnic populations and stuff. You know, most of my friends were kind of black. You know, when you know, I came home and like, you know, I had my patois speaking parents, and I had dance hall in the background and reggae and everything. I very much grew up in black culture, but you know, I had so many kind of people projecting this idea that I wasn't black enough because of the way I spoke or the way that I carried myself and everything, which I think kind of adds on kind of another layer to kind of, you know, mental health issues and everything, just not being seen as black enough. So
I think, obviously, like, in my experience, it was, like, really different. I went to, like, an all-white, like, primary school and then onto, like, a secondary school. I think that growing up, I had more of a tainted, like, skewed view of, like, I guess, blackness, because I thought of myself as, like, somebody different and, like, on the outside, obviously, and, like, I guess going to these schools and not being, like, really, like, delving into my, like, actual roots is kind of, like, just really misconstrued, like, my whole perspective of myself and, like, just black people in general. Like the schools that I went to were just so... They just weren't, like, inclusive in the sense that, like, they didn't have these difficult conversations and, like, I guess it was just, like, pushed to the side. And, like, how you said you had, like, all these, like, music and everything, I just didn't have that. And it's just really, like, Yeah.
And it's really interesting
Yeah.
that you've both had such a different experience because there's the different types of schools you went to,
Yeah.
but there was still a mental health weight.
Yeah.
So your mental health weight was like, I'm very much in a community where there's lots of people that look and sound like me, but I'm not conforming to the group think that
Yeah.
exists here.
Yeah.
And then you're in an environment where you are being put into the minority,
Yeah.
and yet you're still thinking, well, how do I weigh that up against
Yeah.
everyone else that's around me because I'm the other? You're both experiencing the weight of being black. You're
Yeah.
both experiencing the weight of anti-blackness. You're both experiencing the mental health issues that you kind of have to work through in
Yeah.
concerned with that identity, and yet it's completely different.
Yeah.
And yet, is there enough space for that level of nuance in mental health? I'm not sure we always do that. And one of the things that I found, which I found particularly interesting, I was mentioning before we started the podcast,
Yeah.
was that I recently got to go to Gambia and Jamaica.
Oh, wow.
First time having this experience, and I did it quite close together. But what was really interesting about that was that for the first time I was considering, what does it mean to be black somewhere else?
Yeah.
Now, going to Gambia and going to Jamaica, two places where the majority of people are racialized as black, an identity factor about me that I put so much weight on here was irrelevant. So I'm like, hold on, nobody cares that Aisha's black here. But that's a part of my major identity in the UK. That's what I'm studying. That's the way I educate. That's where I work. That's where I make my living.
Yeah.
And yet, somewhere else, it's completely irrelevant. So then it got me thinking about, well, what is the mental health lens of somebody who is racialized as black living in a UK context? Because often what happens, particularly for those who are not first or second generation, you don't have that identity. So whilst I'm Jamaican heritage, I don't really know what it is to be Jamaican. I've never lived there. I don't really get the culture to that extent more than the culture that we see and experience through music and food, for example.
Yeah.
But that's affected my identity because when my son sits with me and he says to me, so, Mummy, your surname isn't really Thomas then, is it? Well, I guess not. So you've got a slave master surname, Mummy? I guess I have. Where do we come from in Africa, Mummy? Because clearly we were transported there, our family. I don't know.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I'm looking at the mental health process that's going through my son's head at 14 going, so who am I? He doesn't know who he is. And he might never know who he is because that identity is not there. And so when you think about what he's having to navigate in the
Yeah.
first instance, for him, he's trying to work out, well, who I am and who he then is. And that's affecting his mental health and well-being because he now doesn't know where to root himself. So we talk about this idea of being rooted and having a place to start to really help you build the foundation of your values, your principles, your understanding that helps you to navigate your mental well-being. He doesn't even have that. So what's the platform that he's starting on? And when I compare it to some of my friends who have children who are first or second generation here, they know who they are. So they're talking about the tribe they come from. They're talking about their materials that they wear. They're talking about their religious connection. And although they're navigating what it means to be racialized as black, they're holding on to their roots.
Yeah.
A root experience that I can't give my son just because of where we started. So when you think about mental health and well-being, even from identity, the starting place is completely different.
Yeah.
And what are we doing in education for those children who don't have a rooted identity to start with? I think it's being missed.
That's really powerful. Yeah.
That was really good. I really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna kind of go back to what like the video of Akala I was watching.
Yeah.
And he was, again, as I said, history, functionally distorted, whatever. And so I was thinking more about, how my dad and I, we clashed a lot because there's a generational difference, there's a cultural difference, even the class difference, because poverty in Jamaica looks totally different to poverty over here. And so we're always talking, and he's like, you're so westernized, and I'm just like, I've grown up here, I've grown up in Bristol, I've grown up in the UK, I've gone to school here, I've consumed media here, and it's like I'm being fed all these kind of messages about like, exceptionalism and white supremacy and stuff, and it's like, how can I even begin to think properly if all I've ever seen is through a privileged perspective? Like, it's like, who am I then? Like,
Yeah.
and the kind of process of like unpacking that is just, it's such an enormous task. And I just think about, you know, the weight it has on my mental health and everything. And I just,
It's huge.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
huge weight, and I think it's a weight that people don't realise you're carrying.
Yeah.
It's almost like you've got this invisible bag on your back all of the time, carrying that weight. And I'll be honest, it's something I didn't really understand until I went to both Gambia and Jamaica. And the reason why is because you read about it, watch a couple of podcasts, textbooks, whatever. But until you're immersed into it. So I'm having a really flippant conversation and I'm not really thinking about it. And I'm like, oh yeah, because, you know, next year, you know, you could just book a flight and go.
Yeah.
And they're going to me, you do realise that you're black and British, right? And I'm like, well, what's the British bit got to give? And they're like, we can't just wake up tomorrow and decide to go on holiday. Like, you've come here as a tourist. We can't do that. We have to first ask our government for permission to go.
Yeah.
And then we've got to ask your government for permission if we can actually arrive. We've got to find the money to pay for our visa. We've got to do this, that, whatnot. And I'm thinking, that's not a mental health weight that I've had to consider. You know, I've not had to carry that weight of what that blackness looks like in comparison to somewhere else around the world. So then I'm thinking about, okay, so does that mean that there's some sort of privilege with being black and British?
Yeah.
And what does that look like? But does that negate my experience around my mental health? I think not. I think it just looks different.
Yeah.
So the mental health issue that I might be dealing with as racialised as black somewhere else may be very different to what we're facing here. But I think what we're facing here is we're having to deal with all the other social constructs around us that are affecting our identity and our being. And there's almost this idea, but you're here, so be grateful.
Yeah.
Yeah? But at the same time, you're going, I get it, but I'm also having to navigate now all of these existences, and there isn't the help or support.
Yeah.
So from a school perspective, we do things such as, we look at ACEs, like I gotta get it right now, adverse childhood experiences, okay?
Yeah.
But racism isn't one of them. How is that not a thing? Like, it is. If I'm a child in this country and I have to go through racism, if I've experienced racism, if it's been traumatic for me, that should be considered an adverse childhood experience.
Yeah.
It
100%.
should be. But if it isn't, that might be the very thing that's affecting my trauma and my experience in education right from the age of 4. When I think about my son coming home and going, Mummy, my friend said I can't go to their party because I'm black, and he's had that experience in primary school, how is that affecting his mental health and well-being? He's saying, Mummy, I don't want to be black anymore. Why? Because black people don't get to go to parties. He's saying that as a child. So how is that affecting his mental health and well-being to who he thinks he needs to be? Because he's not allowed to go to parties. Now, it's not that simplistic, but it is for him when he's a little child and he wants to go, and his friend's saying, well, you can't come for that reason. So when we think about all of the work around mental health and well-being, how much of that is through the lens of blackness? And how much of that is allowing us to see that the same mental health concerns that might exist in those communities racialised as white may look completely different for someone who's racialised as black. And if we don't consider those differences, we run the risk of just going, is a one-size-fits-all approach, but on whose size? And who's the dominant voice in that conversation? And so practitioners need to be more equipped so that they know how to adapt appropriately. So if you came to a teacher or if you came to a practitioner and said, I'm really struggling with what it means to be black, they don't look at you and go, oh, let me go find a black teacher in school who might be able to have a conversation with you about that. And instead, everybody's equipped to at least have a framework to have the conversation.
This obviously is like a massive, massive topic. But in terms of so what age ranges have you kind of taught?
Okay, so in terms of my actual teaching, my age range has been from year 7, so 11-year-olds, right up to 16. So that's like my primary age, very much secondary school based. Done a little bit of work with post-16. I'm also doing lecturing at the university. So primarily, those students tend to be between the age of 18 and 21. Done a few things of primary school and had a little bit of early years experience, but predominantly 11 to 16, I would say, was where the vast amount of my experience has come from.
So I was going to ask, how do you kind of adapt and change, you know, when in terms of when you're talking about racism, how do you kind of adapt and change, and like what are the practices you instill? Does it change, you know, depending on like the age range and stuff?
Absolutely. Like I couldn't sit down with someone who is 3 years of age and go, let's talk about decolonial theory. It's not going to work. But actually, when you're talking to a 3-year-old, they're already noticing differences. So I'll give you share a story with you from my mum. She won't mind me sharing. So she went to a barbecue. My mum was the only person racialised as black. There was a little girl there, and she looks at my mum, and then she's like, "Oh, are you wearing makeup?" And so my mum, because she wears makeup, the eyeshadow and everything, she goes, "Yes." Then the little girl says, "But why did you pick brown, and why are you wearing so much of it?" So then she's thinking, "Oh, your skin is makeup." And my mum said, "Oh, no, this is not makeup. I thought you meant, no, this is my skin. Like, I'm black, like, this is my skin." For this child, this is the first time they'd met anybody that didn't look like their parents, who didn't look like their local community. And so she's meeting a black woman for the first time, and then thinking that her skin is not real because she's not had that experience. My mum then having a conversation with her about skin tone and melanin and difference would have to be age appropriate. But if, I'm meeting someone who's 18 who says to me, I've never engaged with somebody who's black before, we're going to have a different level of conversation. So what's really important is whatever age range you're talking to, it's an age appropriate conversation. Doesn't mean you can't still talk about race or racism and being kind and not being kind, or university level we're going to talk about anti-racist practice and looking at empire, and we're talking about decolonial thought. It's about making sure you adapt it to the person in front of you, or adapt it to the age you're talking to. But I don't think we should shy away from it, whatever generation. Because equally you get the other argument, older generations, oh, well, they're set in their ways. Oh, they can have those thoughts and opinions. Oh, come on, we don't really need it. And the reality is you're never too old to learn. So I'm talking to my nan and she's in her 80s. I still challenge her on the things that she says that are problematic. I'm like, well, Nanny, we don't say this anymore. This is now the language we use. These are now the ways that we talk about race and racism. So I think it's about you as an individual having your core understanding and then being able to scaffold it up and down depending on who you're talking to. But it's important that you do that.
Like, going back to like the colorism and everything, do you think that affects like young black people with their mental health?
Absolutely, and I think it's affecting them because it's been projected on them as much as it might have been their personal lived experience. So within my community, for example, I think there's definitely been a learning curve and there's been a growth between comparing, the grandkids or the cousins because of their skin tone. I think there's been a lot of education within our community about how problematic and harmful that can be. That might be an internal journey we're going through, and some communities are in different places in regards to that conversation. But there's also the external projection on social media that we see all of the time. And it's one of those things where we have to think about how problematic it is and how we as individuals sometimes are propping up and perpetuating those ideologies that say the lighter you are, the straighter your hair, the more beautiful you are. How often are we really celebrating those with darker skin tone as much as we do with those with lighter skin tone? How often are we seeing it on our TV screens? How much are we seeing then challenging our natural kind of starting points? We think about, let's just take the new Disney movie Mermaid. And when Ariel is now somebody racialized as black, and the fact that people found that so problematic and so difficult. I think Disney had something, don't quote me on the number, but it was something like 1.5 million complaints based on people believing that Ariel should still be racialized as white. Now, if you are a young person racialized as black and you're listening to this and you're hearing it, you're thinking, so am I not even good enough to be a fictional mermaid? Is that what you're telling me? How is that affecting their mental health and their well-being? Now, for some people, you might go, well, it's just a Disney character, it doesn't mean anything. But for others, it means a lot for their self-esteem. My son said to me, the little one, he was so excited when Black Panther came out. He was like, Mummy, I can be a superhero. And I'm like, but you could have been a superhero before. He's like, no, Batman's white, Superman's white, Captain America's white. And for him, he couldn't see himself. So how was that affecting his well-being in regards to even visually seeing himself as a superhero, a character, someone who could save lives? And often for those racialized as black, our stories are always pain and trauma. The bad things that have happened to us, the hurt that's happened to us, the harm that's happened to us. And we do that in education. Think about your own educational experience. How many times have the stories been positive and how many times have they been negative? So schools might be talking about different communities, but it's always starting with their pain.
Yeah.
When are we hearing abundance and beauty and joy and celebration so that you are building up these young people so that their mental health is starting with a good understanding of their identity, so they feel good about their community, feel good about themselves? But we just flick on social media, and every time we're having a conversation about what it means to be black, it's painful. You know, I worry, I mean, and, you know, not to be too topical, but, you know, with the recent stuff that's happening in the news now, just about the, you know, another murder in America, it's like, how is that affecting all of you today? How is that affecting all of your mental health? It's on your algorithms, you can't get away from it if you choose to watch the video or don't choose to watch the video, but it's there. What mental health support is now going to be in place for you when you go into school or college on Monday to do with what you watched at the weekend?
Yeah, and it's like, because social media and technology is so vast now, there's no kind of like, I think in sociology we talk about, I don't think it's information hierarchy, but just the idea that, you know, parents could once kind of filter what their children kind of saw. You know, the systems could now, we're much more able to kind of control what we see, and that is still very true to this day. But, you know, I can now kind of go on Twitter and see someone being shot. Do you know what I mean?
Literally.
And there's literally, and there's no censor. And I remember, like, during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, going on Twitter and like every kind of couple of posts would be someone, like a pregnant lady I once saw being thrown on the ground, black pregnant lady, pictures and videos of like black trauma. And then I read this one article that was like, why do we need black trauma to mobilize us? Like that's a serious issue. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Why do we need somebody, you know, being shot and killed
for us
to wake us
act
up
and to do something, and also for other communities to recognise the harm that we're going through? It's like, show us your pain before we'll help you. And so I think there's something really important about us considering the amount of, and what we call it, certainly within the training I do, the vicarious trauma. So the trauma that you might not physically be living, but it's being projected on you because of your identity. And so you're feeling it even though you're not physically in it. And I don't think people understand how much social media is playing a massive part in your mental health and well-being, in constantly seeing people that look like you hurt and harmed. And then what do algorithms do? If you watch something, they start to give you more of it. So now, all of a sudden, all day, you're just getting constant reminders of what it means to be black and harmed constantly. And there isn't the equitable amount of mental health support to challenge those experiences and what you're feeling. And teachers are definitely not getting enough training for them to be equipped to do that work. Doctors, other practitioners, social workers, all those other people that help young people, how much training do they really have on black trauma to be equipped enough to offer you the right support?
I think also, while on the topic of like colorism, like going back to that topic, I was meant to bring in hypermasculinization, and I just wanted to know kind of your thoughts on that, because I think whenever I kind of look at black men, and when I look at obviously this issue isn't specific to black men, but when I kind of looked at my experiences and stuff, I've always felt like the toxic masculinity and this kind of idea of like hegemonic masculinity is so much stronger being a darker skinned black man. I don't know, I just kind of wanted to generally
It's
know
an
your
interesting
thoughts on
one. I
that.
mean, I'm not a man, so it's harder sometimes for me to kind of project my opinion on it.
I guess it's more like from a community level.
At a community level, I would definitely say it's something that I see. And when I think about my son, my dad, my brother, when I think about my kid's father, and I think about the things that I hear them say, particularly to the kids. So it's this idea like, oh, not man up, but for want of a better phrase, like, man up, you're not supposed to behave like that. Or, I don't want you to cry. Or, you can't have that level of emotion. Or, you're not supposed to feel that way. And this is how you're supposed to treat girls. Or, this is how you're supposed to treat women. I have a problem with that because a lot of that I think is culturally linked. I'm not saying all black men behave in that manner, but in some of my experiences, I'm having to kind of almost challenge some of the problematic conversations that almost say, you're a black boy, you must behave like this. You're a black man, this is who you're going to become. And I worry about the toxic nature that exists within that. So when the same way we have to think about misogyny and then misogynoir, I think we have to think about toxic masculinity, but then think about that, but what's the extra layer that might exist within our anti-blackness that we now need to deal with alongside that, and us understanding our black identities. It's layered. And I think it's a real concern. And then when you add in other things, for example, gender identity or sexual orientation, I'm choosing the term that is in the Equalities Act, when you begin to add that into the conversation, it gets even more complex, because it's almost like, well, because you're a black boy, you cannot also be that. It's not an identity that a black boy can have. So now you have to be heterosexual. Why? Because black boys are heterosexual. It's that simple. And I think that's the narrative that's being projected. And so it's such an interesting conversation because, but then at the other end of the spectrum, what I also find, and this is what some children and young people have said to me, is, but then it feels like if I don't want to be that way, there are people in my community who almost say, I can't be a traditional man, or I can't be a black boy in this way because I'm bad, because I'm those things. I'm bad because I am not queer, or I'm bad because I'm not in a same-sex relationship. Like, I'm a black man or a black boy, and I'm attracted to the opposite sex. That they feel like there's a pressure on them because they now don't fit in with some of the younger generation ideologies around fluidity. And so, where does it sit? I think what's most important for me is that young people have the education to actually be able to make the decision that's right for them. That's what's important to me. But I'm also mindful of different generations projecting what it should look like for you today. And that's what's quite tricky.
I think a general kind of theme of this whole conversation is kind of boxing away parts of your identity and packaging it, putting it up on a top shelf and saving it for later and stuff. And I think if we really want to have a kind of true, mature, complex, honest discussion around mental health, we need to bring all those boxes and unpack it. So,
we're forcing ourselves to choose one. But basically what we're saying is, but if you really want to know how my mental health is affecting me, then you're going to have to allow me to open all the boxes. And then I can bring my whole authentic self to the table. Otherwise, I'm censoring, I'm tone policing, so that you can deal with the aspect of my identity that you feel most comfortable dealing with. And probably right now, I can deal with anti-racism. I can deal with racists. I can deal with that. That conversation is one that everybody's having. You want to add these other identities on it? I'm not sure I'm ready for that conversation yet.
Yeah, for me personally, like, I would always box away my Muslim identity, and I wouldn't see myself as more Muslim, and I'd see myself more black and more more of a female. And I think that now I see myself going through all of this Islamophobia, and I see it on the media and everything with France and everything. I think that now I kind of need to unpack that, and I need to realize that this is a part of who I am. And it's crazy how you said that the people just push it away, and you can't be this and this and that because you have two of these. And it's really crazy.
Top trumps. It's a really cool game of top trumps in regards to. So, oh gosh, you're making me feel old now.
No, I know what it is.
So top trumps is a game, and you have different basically scorings for different categories. And so what I'm just trying to say is that essentially you could be in a position where people are adding weight to whether your conversation determine on your score or their interest. So, for example, if you were talking to somebody who might well be Muslim, they might find the conversation so much easier. So it's oh no, let's talk about that part of your identity because it's something that's important to them, something they understand. But if you're talking to someone who doesn't have that connection, it's you're having to educate them before you can even have the conversation. So then you go, that in itself is a weight on your well-being. I've got to educate you about my problem before we can even start it, before we can even find a solution. That's why people will often kind of suppress how they feel because they go for the path of least resistance sometimes, which is, well, what is the area of my identity that you understand? Let's tackle that one first. When we all know it's much more nuanced than that.
Any other thoughts on this whole discussion?
I think if my number one kind of takeaway from this conversation is that it's really important that we recognise that blackness doesn't have one form of identity. And if we truly want to do the work around mental health and well-being, particularly for black young people, we need to allow space for you to be very clear about what blackness means to you, what blackness looks like for you. And what's really important is that when you are getting help and support, you are able to request support that actually relates to your identity. So it isn't just about saying to a doctor, I'm just not feeling great today, I'm not feeling great today, and I need you to understand that my racialized existence is compounding that experience. And so it's a mutual kind of exchange of knowledge, but it's also an effort on the part of the affected and the affector to understand that both of us need to understand that lived experience. But particularly black young people, I need you to understand your identity first. Because once you know who you are, it's much easier for you to know what help and support you need.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it. It's been a nice conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.